precious child, I've called your name. Nothing can take you from my hand. I'm still the same.
Hear the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew. Glory to you, O Lord. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, in whose house the scribes and the elders had gathered. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for false testimony against Jesus, so that they might put him to death. But they found none. Though many false witnesses came forward, at last two came forward and said, "This fellow has said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days." The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. "Have you no answer?" he again said. And the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? You've heard how he's blasphemy. What's your verdict?" And they answered, "He deserves death." Some of you may be familiar with, some of you may have heard a very famous American spiritual song, which is, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" Well-known song, and maybe some of you know the tune as well. And that's a question we're going to sort of look at during this period of Lent each week. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? And what we're going to do to help us to look at this is we're going to look at some of the people who were some of the people involved in either Jesus being crucified or were with him or around him during that period. So we're going to look at individual people, and we're going to look at them in the light of what can we learn from them for us and ourselves today. Some of these people played a big part in, as it were, making the prophecies about Jesus' death that were made throughout the Old Testament, as we have accounts of them, come to pass. And Jesus himself told his disciples many times about the fact that he would be taken and he would be executed. And so we'll see how some of these folk over these next few weeks were involved in that, like I say, in a variety of ways. Today, we're going to begin with the high priest Caiaphas. Now, the high priest, of course, was entrusted to uphold God's honor and among his people, and yet what we see with Caiaphas in this particular episode, and at other times as well through history's accounts, is that here's a man who was guilty of religious duplicity. As we know, when religion turns bad, it carries with it a smell and a stench that is horrendous. And it's that kind of thing that alienates people from faith. You know, especially when there's things like corruption and hypocrisy in the church. When they look at the church and they see those things, and quite often you get that thrown at you if you say that you're a member of the church, and people will sort of say, well, you know, it's full of corruption, it's full of hypocrisy and full of hypocrites and all the rest of it. But when religion goes bad, that's what people see, and that's what people smell, as it were. And it's a kind of warning to us, in a sense, because if we're not careful, we can be like that at times. Jesus spoke to the Pharisees in particular on one occasion. He quoted Isaiah at them when he said, "These people honor me with my lips, yet their hearts are far from me." Of course, he was quoting that at the Pharisees in particular, but it was one of those warnings that it's always worthwhile being aware of, that these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. This theme, again, was picked up by Paul when he wrote a letter to one of his disciples, Titus, and he said this. He says, "They profess to know God, but they deny him by their actions." They profess to know God, and they deny him by their actions. And I think as we approach Lent and are now in Lent and carry on the journey through Lent, we need to reflect on that a little bit. Is it a good warning to us as we reflect and examine ourselves that we sometimes maybe offer lip service to God, and yet our hearts are somewhere else, they're far away? So they may be, at this moment in time, words to the wise, you could say. Well, in the situation that we've just heard from the gospel reading, we see the religious authorities, the kind of the church of the day, the people who represented the temple and represented the people. We see them overturn every single rule of justice and every claim of truth to make sure that Jesus dies. That's what they wanted, and that's what they were determined to get. And that might seem like an exaggeration, that they've turned every single rule and every single truth over to make sure that this man was executed. But what we're going to look at now, just for a moment, is what did happen and what should have happened. So, first of all, as we know, Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane at night time, and he was brought to the house of the high priest Caiaphas. Now, in Matthew's gospel, he recognizes that this is an official gathering. It's the middle of the night. They're all there. This was not an accident that this happened. They were told where to go, where to be, and when to be there. The whole council, he says, gathered at the high priest's house. It's worth remembering that. This was a gathering of what they called the Sanhedrin. This was like the council that was made up of the Pharisees, who were the teachers of the law, the Sadducees, who were the priests, we'll come to that in a second, and the elders. So this council had all sorts of different representatives, all of which seemed to be gathered in this house in the middle of the night. Here's where the other things begin to stack up. First of all, criminal cases were not supposed to have been looked at and tried during the Passover festival. Here they were in the middle of the Passover festival. They should have held it and waited till the Passover festival had been finished and then looked at doing a criminal conviction, if that's what it warranted. If a person, criminal cases as well, within that, if a person was found to be guilty at night time, then a whole day and night had to elapse before they could make a prosecution. The idea being is that it gave the person who was being committed, it gave them an opportunity to provide a case for, defense, as it were. However, this time period was not honored, and Jesus was not given the opportunity to put forward a case for the defense. Again, criminal cases were supposed to be held in the daytime, and they were supposed to be held, this kind of criminal case, in a place called the Hewn Stone. It was the Sanhedrin Hall, which was a section of the temple. So within the temple there was a court, and it was known as the Room of the Hewn Stone and the Sanhedrin Hall. Well, of course, we're in the high priest's house. We're nowhere near the temple, and so daytime and place, both were being violated here. All evidence had to be validated by two separate witnesses, and these witnesses had to have been interrogated separately. Again, not the case. Any false witnesses, actually by their law in those days, could be punished by death. Matthew says that many false witnesses were brought forward until finally two of them were brought forward but had not been examined separately at that time. And on top of all this, the evidence for innocence was supposed to have been given before the evidence for the guilty. So, as you can see, if ever there was a kangaroo court, here it is. But what happens is, when religion goes bad and people want to uphold their own issues and their own priorities and all that sort of thing, these are the things that can happen. Caiaphas, as it were, presses both the church of the day, the temple folk, and the state, if you like, those representing the country and the nation. He presses both of them for Jesus' execution and he succeeds. But what we've got to remember is this. Caiaphas was himself a Sadducee. And the Sadducees, you hear them mentioned many times in the Bible, and Jesus is critical of them quite often, but they were the wealthy, they were the aristocratic, and they were also collaborators with the Roman army and the Roman authorities. Because through their collaboration, they were able to keep their wealth, they were able to keep their comforts, and they were able to keep the power that they had in that nation and hold on to all those things. And by the way, all priests were Sadducees. So it was a nice little cozy club that they had there going on, wasn't it, if you think about it? The last thing they wanted was some young, upstart rabbi coming along and upsetting the status quo. They didn't want somebody coming along and creating a movement and a following that took everything away from what they held dear. And it would seem what they held dear the most was their money and their comfort, their place in society and their power. They thought, and Caiaphas in particular, thought that if we could get rid of this man, it'd solve the problem. That this seemingly growing community would sort of dissipate and go away, and everything would be back to normal, back how it should be, back how we like it. Of course, Jesus once famously said to these people and to others in general, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Sadly, these guys were so blinkered in the way that they viewed what was going on, they could only see revolution in terms of power and power structure, as opposed to in terms of love, God's love. And so we see this situation building and developing. I'm sure that Caiaphas thought he was truly in control of this situation, that he got a handle on it, that it was coming to pass, his wheeling and dealing was working out, and as far as he was concerned, well, you know, we're doing it for God. We're doing all this for God. And so probably felt totally justified in his actions and what he was trying to achieve. But as we know, with hindsight in history, how many times have we seen foolish people use what they're trying to achieve as we're doing it for God, and so therefore it must be all right? How much rubbish have we seen come out of America sometimes from the churches there, and on the basis of we're doing it for God. And that's why I drive around in 5 mega cars and have a wonderful mega house with lots of mega swimming pools. You seem to forget things like the rich young man who came to Jesus and said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And of course, the story goes on until finally Jesus says, well, there's one thing you lack actually. Great, you did all that's wonderful stuff. One thing you lack. Go and give all your possessions to the poor, and then come and follow me. And the young man went away sad. How many times have we seen all sorts of other circumstances where people have used religion and God as an excuse for justifying what they actually want for themselves? It's a trap that we can all fall into if we're not careful. And so as we are in this period of Lent, we should constantly be questioning and testing our reasons and our motives for what we do and why we do it. As we know, and again, because we're a people a few thousand years later, we can look back and we see that actually, in this situation, Jesus was the one who was in control. It might have looked, from his perspective, or as we view his perspective, totally out of control. But as we can tell, he was in control of it, because by allowing them to do what they did, he ultimately was able to fulfill his calling and his destiny. He knew where he was going. He knew where this was going to end, or seemingly end, as the Easter story would let us know. So here's a couple of questions just to finish with now and to ponder as we consider this particular person in the context of the bigger story. And it's these things I'm going to leave you with today. Does that which we value most marry with that which God values most? Does that which we value most marry with that which God values most? That's one to consider. And the second one is this: do our words and our actions mirror each other, or are they poles apart in relation to the Christian faith we look and say we uphold? I'll say that one again. Do our words and our actions mirror each other, or are they poles apart in relation to the Christian faith that we claim to uphold? So in the light of Caiaphas, in the light of Lent, and in the light of the Easter we'll be celebrating in a few weeks' time, let's just ponder those things, maybe during this coming week.
My emotions are up and down, but your love is never down. Oh Lord, I'm so glad you are here. Your love had you die for me, then you came back to life for me. Oh Lord, I'm yours forever. No height or depth, or life or death can separate us from the love of Christ. No angels or demons or all of creation can separate us from the love of Christ. My shackles you tossed away, my sin is so far away, as far as the east from the west. Though battles may still go on, the war is already won, 'cause Jesus is alive. No height or depth, or life or death can separate us from the love of Christ. No angels or demons or all creation can separate